Hello, this is Mikhail. I am the founder of Idea Space Travel, Ireland's first space tourism travel agency. A week ago, my old friend Samuel Coniglio was here in Ireland, and I used the chance to sit down with him and chat with him about space in general and a book he wrote recently. Samuel is a futurist, a technical writer, photographer, an inventor, and private space industry advocate. In this episode 3 of Season 2 of High Altitude Adventures podcast, we will talk with Samuel about space industry, manned space program, and world's first fully reusable rocket. And this is not SpaceX Starship or Falcon 9, by the way. So how long do we know each other? Like 30 years at least.
A long time.
1990 something, 3, 4?
4, 5, 6.
There was
94,
a launch of a space shuttle, which I think didn't go up.
I thought it went up, but
It did?
maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, it was really exciting anyway, because remember, it was our first time in Kennedy Space Center.
Yes.
We took a group of Russian space students there, and it was a good time.
Yeah. Your first time, right?
Not in US.
Oh, really?
I was in US in 1986. Young astronauts, young cosmonauts exchange program. This was my first time. But anyway, yeah, long time ago, 30 years at least.
It's been a while. Now,
remember, this is an episode which will be video and audio, so we should cater to the lowest denominator. So we talk to people who don't see us. So remember this. So now, first, tell us about you. So what are you? Who are you? How are you involved in space, tourism?
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Good to see you. It's been quite a while. I was hosting the group of students in 1994, I think it was, who were coming in to see the first space shuttle launch to the Mir space station. It was the first international collaboration with the United States and Russia, and we were having these exchange programs, which was quite exciting. And so I was working for McDonnell Douglas at the Kennedy Space Center. I worked on the Space Shuttle and Space Station program at the time, and so one of the extracurricular things I did was being a host for international visitors, and so I was there to help host these young students who were very excited about America and space and all that, and wanted to see what it'd be like to see this, to witness the space shuttle launch itself, which is very exciting. I've seen over a dozen, lots of fun. So you came to the United States with your friends, your students, and we had a little bit of tour of what it's like to be an American, and also a tour of the Kennedy Space Center, and then we went to the launch site to see the launch itself. Yeah, so that was a great event. I just had a wonderful time meeting you and meeting all the other students, and just understanding the cultures. And I actually was, when I was a student back in the 1980s, I had a brief moment as a cultural exchange student in the Soviet Union, when it was still called the Soviet Union. 1988, there's this thing called perestroika that was just happening, where Russia was starting to open up a little bit, and foreigners were coming in and they were coming out, and new ideas were happening. It was a very exciting time because possibilities, anything could be happening. So for a few months, actually it was just for a week. It was a week in Russia. Got to explore a little bit and see how the Soviet life.
No space though. They were just cultural.
It was just basically a cultural trip. That was back in the 1980s. 1990s. Now we have these Russian students coming to America. We give you a crash course of pizza.
By the way, you were involved with Friends and Partners in Space. I forgot what was the name of the organization.
Oh yeah,
You were involved with some group.
I was involved with several different space organizations at the time. Friends and Partners in Space was one of them. I've been involved with Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, SEDS, and then of course the National Space Society, later on Space Frontier Foundation, and a dozen other space organizations. But yeah, so international collaboration was a great moment to be able to work with students from around the world, and we had an introduction to NASA and the Kennedy Space Center, and I like to talk, and so we got to meet people.
Okay, so and education, training, work experience.
Okay, so I'm a little bit different from your normal space person. I am not an engineer.
Okay, wait. In the nearest future, actually now, we won't need engineers only and fighter pilots and Superman and Wonder Woman in space. For now, we can say that it will be open for everyone, and space will need all kind of people to work there.
We need regular people.
Regular people. And you represent a regular person.
I guess so.
Who will...
Do I look like an engineer? No? You know? So the idea, and the part of why I wear this is that I want to feel human and have fun and also enjoy the space activities. And I have a lot of experience that most people don't have with interacting with scientists, engineers, politicians, business leaders, all aspects of the space industry that are not just engineering and astrophysics and very focused specific areas. I consider myself a generalist, surrounded by specialists. And that's how I got my book published, was because I could translate what they were saying into English so that a broader audience could understand what's going on. And when I say English, I mean taking very technical terminology and concepts and using analogies and metaphors to make it understandable for a broader audience.
So, in a way to inspire normal common people to actually pursue and seek careers in space, what is your training? Your English language major, right?
So, I have a degree in English specializing in technical writing and editing.
Mm-hmm.
And the technical writer, what they do is they work with technologists of all kinds, engineers, scientists, specialists, very specialized field. It could be in the biomedical field. It could be any type of very technical scientific field. And my job is to translate, understand that terminology, understand what they're saying, document it in a way that is useful for other people or for other scientists or engineers or whatever. But to make the knowledge available to a broader group, instead of just simply these specialists, we try to expand it out. And I've developed websites, and I'm doing user guides. I'm creating technical manuals. I'm creating support guides. I'm doing all sorts of, my running joke is, I write the books that no one reads.
Well, but sometimes they need your book in the critical...
Until something breaks,
until something
and
happens.
then they read the manual. It's like, why did this break? Oh no. And so I'm the guy that has to keep that manual up to date because the technology changes. Things, after every break, we have to make a repair. We got to document the repair, make sure it's ready for the next release or the next test or whatever we're doing.
Just like a bullet point, which companies have you worked with or worked for from the space industry?
So surprisingly, very few. My first job out of college was at McDonnell Douglas at the Kennedy Space Center. It was amazing. Working on Space Shuttle and space station documentation. So for the U.S. Space Shuttle, I was involved with what was called the Partial Payload Checkout Unit. It was a system that tested the fit, form, and function of every payload that went inside the Space Shuttle payload bay. So satellites, space lab, other equipment, we had to make sure that they physically fit, that the electrical connections worked properly, that the computers were doing what they're supposed to be doing, that the interface with the Space Shuttle computers and also physical systems and technical systems, we had to make sure that that was all tracked and documented.
And when was that? Which years?
From late 1990 through late 1995. So
Okay.
only about 5 years, not that long.
So we didn't intersect with it because I worked for Boeing from '98 once they acquired the McDonnell Douglas.
So yeah, that's a long, complicated
Before
story
that,
there
right,
with
okay.
McDonnell Douglas and Boeing.
This is,
were
yeah,
two totally different worlds, and then
different-
when they merged,
I
it was a
know.
different ballgame.
Totally different topic for a totally different
Yes.
podcast maybe one day.
Yes.
Okay, which other companies?
So, I love space. I thought I'd be working in the space industry for years. I wanted to be an astronaut, the whole 9 yards. But I also realized after working in the industry that the pace of change was so glacially slow that it felt like we would never make it to the moon again in my lifetime because everything was so slow, very bureaucratic. You had NASA as the primary customer, and you had all these contractors that will just say, whatever NASA wants, we do. There was no incentive to speed things up. There was no incentive to create new things. We had this project called the Space Shuttle. Great, we're working on that. We had this project called the Space Station. Great, we're working on that. But there was no interest at NASA to build a better spaceship, or to build a faster spaceship, or to build more space stations. they were lucky to get enough budget to do what they can do. NASA is subject to the whims of Congress, the U.S. Congress. And so there was really not much interest in innovating.
But to be fair, Congress represents the will of people. So I think the first thing which happened is the interest kind of deflated, went down a bit. More exciting things became more exciting for normal people. That's why space was not the first priority.
Well, as we talked about this before, in the 1960s, the glory days of the space race and NASA versus the Russian counterpart or the Soviet counterpart, there was the space race. There was like this. It was not just a space event; it was a political event. Instead of us competing with the Soviets militarily, like having a war or something like that, we were competing almost like in a sportsman-like conduct. We had these things. We were building spaceships. We were sending the first, we were sending this first man in space, or the first chimp in space, or the first dog in space, or everybody likes those firsts. And society was all getting excited because you had the newspapers and the media getting everyone all riled up. It's like, oh my goodness, they're beating us to the moon. Oh my gosh, those darn Soviets are going to beat us. Oh no, it's bad for our pride. It's bad for our image. Oh heavens. Then the race was on, and John F. Kennedy made his famous speech. Everybody got excited, and there was funding to build this thing called NASA and this whole program for going to the moon. And meanwhile, the Soviets were doing the same thing. And so it was a neck and neck race. It was like, oh, okay, who's going to win the race? It was basically a track meet. It was like the track meet with two countries. The Soviet representative, the U.S. representative, and let's go, run, 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 run. We're not shooting each other. We're just simply competing to get to this destination, the moon. And so both sides were working hard to gather an army of engineers and technologists from all over the country to do this thing. And so that's what NASA did. Also, politically, to get support from the various groups in Congress for NASA, they had to spread the money around, spread the love. And that's why you have Johnson Space Center in Texas, Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, Ames Space Center in California, Goddard in Maryland, and so on. So they spread these space centers all over the United States to spread the congressional money and make everyone happy in those congressional districts so that we can have a space program working. So you had a nice balance there. Everybody's excited. We got the funding. We're racing to the moon, racing to the moon, racing to the moon. We did it. Great. We had the great celebration. We landed on the moon, and then people lost interest. The race was over.
Which is normal.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we went to the moon. What are we going to do next? I don't know. Space stations? Whatever. So NASA went from being the star child of America, like this is like the most exciting thing representing America, go, 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 to becoming just another government bureaucracy. And the perception for many, many years, like for decades, was that if you want to do anything in space, you have to go through NASA, because NASA was like the official organization for space, which is more or less true. But I was involved at McDonnell Douglas at a very interesting time. When I was at McDonnell Douglas, one of the projects that popped up that I got involved in was with this little thing called the Delta Clipper Experimental. And the Delta Clipper Experimental was not a NASA project. It was run through the Department of Defense. And what is the Delta Clipper Experimental? Well, it was the world's first fully reusable rocket ship. Took off, landed. Took off, landed. In the 1990s, this was unheard of. This was inconceivable. Today, we have SpaceX, we have Blue Origin, we have Virgin Galactic. We're used to the idea of rockets taking off and landing. But for decades and decades, actually longer than that, people could not conceive of that idea of a rocket taking off and landing and reusing it like an airplane, like a car. Amazing. Wow. So it was between 1991 through 1996, the DCX project came into being as a concept for reusability, just to prove that you can take off and land a rocket. Amazing, exciting. But NASA was not involved at all. This was the Department of Defense project. And the Department of Defense got involved with this project through some very interesting conversations from a science fiction author and a rocket scientist who said we needed to do more. than what NASA was doing. Because as I said, NASA did their trip to the moon. Yay, we're very excited. Public lost interest. Funding dropped. The Space Shuttle limped along for many years until they finally got the first vehicle built in the early 1980s and started flying. But it took them many years to get going. The excitement was fading. They had to get a little boost of funding to get going. But these other projects started coming into play. Gerard K. O'Neill was famous for his space stations, giant spinning cylinders, and the Dyson Sphere and other designs were popping up about the idea of future space stations. During the 1970s, up to the current day, you had a whole series of space stations being built by the Russians and by the Americans. You had Skylab, you had Salyut, what was it, Salyut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
Well, also Almaz, which was secret military station.
Oh yes, and Almaz, yes. And then eventually
Mir.
eventually the Mir space station. The Russians were very good at the space station work because they just kept testing it out, building new ones, sending new ones up. So they had the superior advantage in space station design. We built Skylab, which worked really well, but we kind of lost interest in it.
Well, several projects were cancelled, right?
Exactly. That was in the 1970s. So that faded away. Meanwhile, Space Shuttle came into play. That was all good and fine. But we had a problem in the 1980s and 90s where there was this perception that, well, we should only have the Space Shuttle. We don't need these other rockets. So the Delta, the Atlas, and Titan were used primarily for military launches and a few commercial ones, but they're incredibly expensive. They could only fly once, and they can only be used, and it took many months for them to fly, and much preparation and effort. The Space Shuttle, the theory was they were going to fly up to once a month. They never got to that. You're lucky they flew every 3 to 6 months, if you're lucky. It was a great, reliable vehicle, but we needed more. And there was this battle brewing between the government bureaucracy, known as NASA, and the top 5 NASA contractors that were there at the beginning when they first landed on the moon, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed Martin, Northrop, all those guys who basically lived off of the funding from NASA, and then a small group of private entrepreneurs. There was a ragtag band of entrepreneurs who wanted to get into space via other means. They asked the question, why can't we go up there on a regular basis? Why can't we fly daily, weekly, or monthly? Why can't we fly this cheaply? Why can't we do this all the time? Why can't we have multiple space stations? Have your government space station over here and have multiple private space stations so you can have research laboratories, hotels, gas stations, stuff like that. Why do we have to rely on one organization to do one space station? And that's it.
And this was 70s, 80s?
Well, 80s once.
Well, primarily 80s and 90s and early 2000s. There were these proposals by various individuals who wanted to expand the human experience in space, going beyond what NASA was doing. NASA was taking forever to do any type of progress. The reality was they lost interest. No one really wanted to push the envelope of what's the next spaceship going to look like or what the next space station is going to look like. They were lucky they could get funding for the existing ones. The International Space Station, as we know it, would not exist today without the help of the Russians. There was this space station freedom concept proposed by Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s. Space station freedom. That cost many billions of dollars. Congress was like, I don't know, I don't think this is going to work. And then someone got this geopolitical idea of, well, the Soviet Union has a lot of experience with space stations. And they have this thing called the Mir space station.
And we were already into 90s when freedom, perestroika, and all the good stuff was happening.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So there were these changes going on. A new relationship was happening. It was the age of possibility, with Russia becoming a new player, working with us. Not competing, working with us to create a new future in space. Then they have these space modules. They're about ready to build a Mir 2 space station. They've got the modules built, or they were building it. And NASA was struggling to get the basic modules built for the US space station. And then somebody said, hey, let's work together. Times were changing. This was the 1990s, and there's new opportunities were coming up. And there was a struggle to get advancement, get progress going on there. And so the space station was formed because NASA decided to team up with the Russians. And that's why the International Space Station exists. And even though it was very expensive and took a lot of effort, it worked out pretty well.
Step back.
Delta Clipper.
Thank
Give me a quick brief, because that's important.
That's important. So I'm bringing this all. I'm telling you this whole space station story and about collaboration, cooperation, and progress. Back to the story of the DCX, the Delta Clipper Experimental, was that a group of private space individuals who had political connections contacted Vice President Dan Quayle in 1988 and proposed this concept of a reusable rocket ship. And they said, we don't want to go through NASA. And they were saying, Dan was like, well, where do you want to do it? It's like, let's do it through the DoD. More trivia for you.
By the way, you're not revealing any secrets, right?
Nothing is top secret here. This is obscure history. There's a science fiction author by the name of Jerry Pournelle. If you look him up, he's written tons of science fiction. He's also a very conservative political guy. He's dead now, but anyways, may he rest in peace. Very interesting fellow. And he was the person that made the connection with the politicians to propose this concept. And he had connections in the space industry, private space people that want to build rockets. So he put two and two together and said, hey, we're going to build this thing. And so Dan Quayle talked to DoD folks. They found a niche. So there was this project called the Brilliant Pebbles Project. There was this program called SDIO, the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization.
I remember that one.
Ronald Reagan made these grand proclamations about, those darn Soviets have these big missiles. Let's see if we can stop them by creating a missile defense system.
And my shameless plug, that thing bankrupted Soviet Union because they thought that's real, and they started investing tons of money into fighting this hypothetical threat, which never happened on the American side, but still Russians invested tons of money into countermeasures for things which were never coming.
And they have some new stuff out there right now, which we'll talk about later. Anyways, so this Brilliant Pebbles concept, it was basically anti-missile satellites. They wanted to put hundreds of these things in orbit so that they can drop these missiles or drop these, I don't know what they were going to do. Somehow they were going to stop the missiles from flying. So the justification for the DCX rocket through the DoD was, we can't launch all these hundreds of Brilliant Pebbles anti-missile satellites into orbit because the rockets we have cannot fly enough, cannot fly continuously, cannot be reused. We couldn't rely on just a space shuttle flying every few months, could not rely on the American rockets from flying a couple times a year if you're lucky. We needed a whole bunch of satellites up now and quickly, and the best way of doing that is having a reusable rocket. So, the military has done many programs called the X-plane projects, where they had prototype aircraft to push the envelope of aviation technology. So the concept of X vehicles were coming back in the 1990s, one of which was called the DCX, the Delta Clipper Experimental. So that's when the DCX was born. It was actually a department. It was built under the SDIO program initially, and they got only $95 million for funding, which is, of course, nothing. It's a drop in the bucket.
Public money.
Public money. This is all government funding to build this reusable rocket. Because my friends who were in the private space industry could not get any funding from anybody because no one would take them seriously, period. So, we're going through the DoD. Contract was given to McDonnell Douglas. So, in mid-1990, this project was announced to the world, and McDonnell Douglas won the contract, and they went all in. McDonnell Douglas's corporation they begged, borrowed, and stole resources, people, and equipment from all over the divisions, all over the United States. Their avionics division, their military division, their commercial aircraft division, all sorts of stuff to get this rocket built, this one rocket built as a prototype. Here's a funny one for you. Have you ever heard of anyone leasing a rocket engine before?
No.
They did.
During the DCX.
McDonnell Douglas negotiated with Pratt & Whitney to get 4 RL-10A5 rocket engines to lease. And when the project was over, they would return it. Have you ever heard of anybody returning a rocket after using it? Right? This is what happened. So, starting around 1991, Until 1996, there were a dozen flights of this vehicle. It flew 12 times. Rocket would take off, it would maneuver a little bit, and land.
How high?
It varied for every flight. Sometimes it was 300 feet. No, it was 1,500 feet, 5,000 feet. I think it made it to 10,000 feet. It wasn't very high, very tall altitude, high altitude. But the idea was just simply to test the reusability aspect of a rocket. These little landing pads would pop out, landing gear would pop out at the bottom. The engines were steerable or throttleable, so they can go in different directions. And some of the later flights, they would literally take off, lean over like this, go like this, and land.
So lean over 90 degrees
Yes.
for people who just...
So for anybody who watched the recent SpaceX Starship flight, they did the exact same thing, but much higher.
So these engines were reusable, restartable, throttable, and the main thing which was tested there is just the control logic, so how this thing would fly, because it flew itself, automatic, fully automatic.
My team that I worked for, McDonnell Douglas, worked on the Flight Operations Control Center. It was a mission control in a tractor trailer. Basically, a tractor trailer truck, full-on mission control, mobile. Because it was a military project and also a low-budget project, everything was mobile. The entire launch pad was mobile, the entire storage system for the vehicle was mobile, the launch control system was mobile, everything was mobile and practical. All of this flew out of White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico during that time frame, and everything was small, lean, and mean.
So it flew 12 times, and then it was put on ice, scrapped,
So, actually, after the first 2 or so flights, they ran out of money, and they got stuck. Actually, it was like 3, 4, 5. They only were able to do a handful of flights before they ran out of money, because $95 million is not that much. By the way, I should mention, they built this whole rocket in 18 months. From idea to actual ready to go, 18 months. How many rocket projects do you know of that can be done that quickly?
No.
Doesn't. It doesn't. It's unheard of.
Was the DoD happy with the results?
Oh, they were very excited about it. But there was a budget issue. There was not enough funding. This was, like I said, there were some interesting characters behind the scenes that got the initial funding for it, but they couldn't get a lot of funding for it. And now a group of activists came into play. An organization called the Space Frontier Foundation that's been around for a couple of years, but they really became activated with the DCX project because it represented the future. The future of private space travel, reusable rocketry. Let's expand the human presence in space, whether it's colonies, whether it's gas stations, whether it's hotels, whether it's factories, whatever. Let's speed up the development of capabilities of doing things in space. And the Space Frontier Foundation believed that the DCX project was one of the ideal role models. So they lobbied Congress to find ways to get more funding and to find another home for the project, because DoD was, they lost interest, they didn't have enough funding, didn't know what to do with it, where do we go? And then the irony was after flight number 8, the new owner of this project was NASA.
They purchased the project from McDonnell Douglas?
They didn't really purchase it, it basically was reassigned. It was reassigned to NASA. And so it was now called the DCX-A Advanced, and because they did a lot of enhancements to the fuel tanks. They replaced the aluminum ones with, I think, lithium hydroxide tanks, something like that, to make it lighter. They did a bunch of other advancements to the system to make it lighter, more reliable than the previous generation of the rocket. So there were advances. One of the reasons that NASA took on this project was because Dan Golden, the administrator at the time, had this mantra called better, faster, cheaper. We should be building better, faster, cheaper rockets than we are doing right now. And in his early days as the NASA administrator, he was pushing the big 5 contractors like, hey, can we build the space shuttle better? Can we make it more reliable? Can we improve upon it? Of course, he didn't get much progress, but at least he tried. And he thought the DCX is a good role model of what the future could be.
Do you think DCX inspired people who followed, like Bezos?
It inspired dozens and dozens of space startups. Most of these companies you'd never heard of, such as X-Core Aerospace, Rotary Rocket, Kistler Space, Kelly Space. All these companies are dead and gone.
But they try to imitate the same model
of reusability.
Reusability.
Fully reusable rocket ship or rocket plane or whatever. They pushed the envelope for many years in the 1990s and early 2000s. The struggle, of course, was for funding. Slowly, the perception was changing of NASA was the only way to get anything in space to investors and private businesses could possibly put something in space. Epilogue for the DCX. When that project ended, representatives from Mr. Jeff Bezos' company went to the team, the DCX team, saying, hey, I like this idea a lot. I want to build one. Can you give me the plans? The DCX members handed it to him on a silver platter.
And that was the NASA phase of
Not
this
NASA.
project.
So it's hard to explain what's going on. NASA itself really didn't have much to do with the project, except they were like the caretakers, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
The McDonnell Douglas team was really where the action was at. They knew everything about this vehicle, how to make it better, what the future could be like, and so on. I should mention really quickly about something called X-33, which in the 1990s, late 90s, actually it was early 2000s, late 90s, 96 through 2000, NASA proposed a prototype X vehicle called X-33, a possible replacement for the Space Shuttle. There were three competitors, McDonnell Douglas, Rockwell, and Boeing. Rockwell blew the dust off of a 1970s era rocket. It's like, here, they just like threw this project out. It's like, here, what do you think about that? Lockheed Martin, Boeing, yeah. So Lockheed Martin had this like extremely complicated triangle-shaped rocket vehicle, aerospike engine, very complicated, very difficult. It was like they just threw all the hardest technologies possible into one vehicle. And then there was McDonnell Douglas that was about to be acquired by Boeing. They proposed this thing called the DC-1. It was going to be DC-Y. It was the successor to the DCX that was going to be bigger and more reliable and more powerful. And they had a working prototype. It was flying. So they had plans for the DCX, the DC-Y, and then eventually DC-1 as a production flying model. They had a working vehicle. It was flying. All these other guys had these PowerPoint projects that went nowhere. Guess who was chosen? Lockheed Martin. Because they had the political connection and they had the most complicated project that was there, so they could fund enough employees, basically. It was totally politically motivated. So, McDonnell Douglas lost it. The DCX project finally came to an end. And actually it came to an end primarily because one of the landing gears failed on the last test. The flight flew fine, landing gear failed, crashed and burned. And that was the end of the rocket. 1986.
And then McDonnell Douglas.
Right around that time, McDonnell Douglas was struggling to keep, struggling for funding, really struggling for support, and they eventually were acquired by Boeing.
And then they transferred all those documents
They handed the documents to Jeff Bezos, and then about a year or two later, some guy named Elon Musk learned about this thing. He said, hey, this is pretty cool. I'm starting this rocket company called SpaceX. I want to learn more about it.
When was that? Which year?
So, Blue Origin was formed in 2001. SpaceX was formed in 2002.
All right, so Delta Clipper. I knew the history. You were very vocal about it when we met first time. So, and I bet a lot of people who are listening to us now have no clue.
Most people have no clue what this is. Unless you read some real esoteric space articles, you'll never know about this project, even though it was super influential to both Blue Origin and for SpaceX.
I'm sure we have enough material for 2 podcasts.
Yeah, so that was basically my second book. I just told you. Everything I just told you was for my second book. Haven't even gotten to my first book yet.
No, but we're getting to that. So now,
Our conversation with Samuel Coniglio will continue in episode 4 of this podcast. Thank you and goodbye.